Welcome back, everybody. And I'm so glad that you're able to chime in on our True Talk Thursday. And if for our audience that are watching it live, if you want to go ahead and submit a question, please feel free to do so. I'm sure that the ladies in the house tonight will be more than happy to answer them. So we were just talking about what types of ledge have you had your hand in your time here in DC? And so, Laura, you're up. Let's hear it.
Great. So my experience is on the regulatory side, and for the audience, I'll just quickly break down what that means. So Congress passes the laws, and what the federal agencies do is they pass rules, they pass guidance, they do monitoring, and they provide technical assistance, all of which give an additional framework, if you will, on top of law. Because as a law stands, it's really tough to implement because a lot of times it has big holes in it. And so what the regulatory process does is try to fill those holes. So I was with the Obama administration right at the beginning of them implementing the Recovery Act money, huge pots of money that established the Race to the Top Fund, for example, that gave hundreds of millions to the School Improvement Grants Program, which is within Title I to turn around low performing schools. So we were in a position to make vast policy regulations. And that was also the time when the Elementary and Secondary Succeeds Act, which is the original name for what today is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, it was due to be reauthorized or renewed. And Congress just wasn't going to do it. And the way that that law was built, it had a deadline in it for schools to meet where all of their students were proficient, could read at grade level, and could do math at grade level, 100% of students. And while there weren't many schools that did that for all of their students. So we were at the point where more and more schools were being deemed failing according to that law. And we were getting lots of pushback from state school chiefs, district heads, superintendents, other advocates that we needed to do something. Well, there's a provision within that law that has since been changed because I think Congress is not too happy how we utilize the authority, the waiver authority. But we essentially created what many people call the No Child Left Behind waivers. We called it ESEA flexibility. And it created policy in 3 areas. So standards and assessment, accountability, and teacher evaluation and support systems. And we said, okay, states, in exchange for you agreeing to taking on some of these new policies, we will waive some key provisions of No Child Left Behind, namely that deadline, as well as them having to use a portion of their federal funding for certain activities. We waived that. And it was, I thought it was pretty successful, and it depends how you define that, but 43, 44 states, I think, came in for, got a waiver eventually. And it also so happened that I was working at the department at the time where there was a lot of turnover. And I was like one of the last men standing in the office that oversaw all of this work. Like quite literally, like my assistant secretary had left and my chief of staff had left, and it was kind of me. I was like in charge of a whole heck of a lot of stuff. And I was like, I don't know that I should be the person that's doing this, but okay, approved. And, you know, it was a really fascinating time to be able to just create policy and to identify, okay, well, what is our policy objective? Okay, and how can we use the law to get there? It was an incredible masterclass of policymaking. And a lot of what was in ESEA flexibility is now codified in ESSA. And the parts that Congress didn't like the teacher evaluation piece, well, that's just optional. So I like to say that I had a hand in creating what is now ESSA. And because I was that last man standing, I ended up creating several new programs, one being a program for tribes to create their own sort of accountability systems, because we knew that that was something that tribes really wanted to do. But yeah, I would say almost everything on the regulatory side I have done. So regulations, dear colleague letters, you name it, I've done it.
That's awesome. I want to circle back to something each one of you, brought up when answering this question. And one area is that, Roxanne, you talked about early on how, you felt like you were lucky enough. Let me thread it back to that. You said, I was lucky enough, and I don't want kids to have to be lucky enough, right? Some of the things that are happening right now, we're hearing like there's nearly a 50% drop in FAFSA applications, and that's, it's worrisome, right? And especially when we talk about the resources that are starting to actually have been hit in the districts, right, and the states. So when it comes to thinking about that as a need, obviously, and then thinking about what Laura just said right now, when it comes to the reg side of things, there's, flexibilities in a lot of what's written. And I want to get your thoughts on thinking about what those resources that are going to be delivered or are being delivered to school districts and states, and being able to say, okay, what are those flexibilities? How do we ensure, yet, with the flexibilities, how do we ensure that the resources are reaching the kids that need them most? And I'm sure that y'all have thought about this as it's great, and we're grateful to have the funds allocated, but there's also a lot of chatter right now about how these dollars are being earmarked. What are your thoughts behind the flexibilities and the guardrails and all of that when it comes to, for lack of a term, monitoring how the money is being utilized?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as this group works closely together on these issues, we are very excited about the recent COVID relief package that was passed. It's a huge investment in our public schools, in institutions of higher education and students that are enrolled in higher education. And I think it's coming at a time that it very much is needed. As you said, there's a lot of need out there. But as you said, I think there is, from our perspective, from a civil rights perspective, we need to make sure that those resources really are reaching the students that really need it, the communities, the schools that really need it. And the money's the pot of funding is broad, it's flexible, which is good, so that states and locals can make the decisions that are best suited for their local context. But we do want to make sure that that the money is getting from the Unidos perspective. We really care about making sure that students learning English get the resources that they need, right? Because we know that they have been at a disadvantage pre-COVID and even more so during COVID, right? And for us, a lot of that has to do with having data on how students have been, faring during this past year of virtual learning, knowing, what students have been receiving adequate instructional time, what students have maybe not, because they have not had access to, devices or high-speed internet at home. So there are a lot of things that we know anecdotally, and there are a lot of things that we do have some data on, but we do think that having access to assessment data will help target some of those resources. Having opportunity to learn measures will help again tailor those resources so that we're not kind of blindly allocating resources in a way that's not equitable. So in a way that, isn't going to the students most in need. And I will say that to your point about the reduction in FAFSA, for Latino students, Latino students have been seeing a steady growth in higher education enrollment for decades. One of the only populations in higher ed that's growing until this past fall. And so it's the first decline in Latino higher education enrollment in, over a decade.
Yeah. I have to interrupt you. I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
but I just had a meeting with someone here at the Department of Ed this afternoon, and he was claiming how the Latinos, we were, believe it or not, a lot of people don't even know this, but we're at 82% graduation rate.
Mm-hmm.
That's the national is 85. So there are significant gains that have been happening. Mm-hmm. For this now to happen. It's like,
yep. It's jeopardizing all of that, all of those strides that have been made. And so this investment comes at a good time, but we need to make sure that it really is going, to what students really need. And we know as far as higher ed, a lot of those challenges are financial. So I will stop with my remarks so that other folks can weigh in.
And I would say ditto to everything Roxanne said, to maybe put a little slightly more positive spin on some of where the targeting of dollars is going. Completely agree with the need for getting data to better target resources. But this package is just unprecedented, right? In terms of the amount of dollars are actually going to K-12. We saw in the first package, the numbers, the first CARES Act package had about $30 billion to K through 16. So K-12 and higher ed. We had about $82 billion for K through 16 in the second COVID package. But the American Rescue Plan is giving a whopping $165 billion to K-12 and higher ed, which is unprecedented. And so there's a ton of flexibility in how states can use those dollars. One of the things that we really appreciated seeing is the 5% set aside that goes directly to addressing learning loss for LEAs. And I believe it's 20% for states. Or is it the opposite? It's 20% for LEAs and 5% for states who have to do learning loss. And there's a whole host of things under what constitutes as addressing learning loss. It's anything from academic support during the day to access to summer enrichment opportunities over the summer, music programs, sports, things that are going to get students engaged and coming back to school in the fall when they have been sitting in front of a computer for the lucky ones, or just sitting at home, honestly, for some of the folks who don't have access to Wi-Fi and internet and devices. I think the number was about 20 million pre-COVID, the number of students that did not have internet at home. We knew that was an issue, but nothing was being done. And it reminded me a little bit about the way we used to think about Hurricane Katrina. And it took a literal storm for this reform to come to this city that was already underperforming and not doing what they needed to do for kids. And now it's taken a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, to get money allocated, which did not come until this third COVID package, but thankfully it finally did come to improve the E-rate program under the FCC so that kids can have access to devices and internet connectivity. So regardless of a pandemic, being able to even just get the internet to do your homework is going to be a huge, improvement for so many students across the country. So, we're just optimistic about the flexibilities that have been put in here, a lot of mental health supports. Hopefully, we know the need for guidance counselors and mental health providers in schools, and not every school has that, even if it's Title I school. So we're really optimistic about the way that these billions of dollars will be able to be used, but it's up to folks like us, right? Everybody around this table and more, to really help educate states and districts on how they can use their dollars to best achieve the types of interventions that are gonna close gaps during this really difficult time for teachers and kids alike.
Well, since my colleagues covered most of it, the only thing I have to add is that there's what I'm seeing a lot in the media in terms of recommendations for how to use the funding. It strikes me as more business as usual. And I think we're at a moment where we really can and should reimagine what the school experience looks like, especially for the kids that we fight for. Because as Roxanne said, we knew that they weren't doing well prior to the pandemic. We know that they're suffering more during the pandemic. And when they go back, they're going to be at an even greater distance from where they need to be, frankly. And it's tempting to say, let's do high dose tutoring, 5 days a week, reading and math, and that's just more drill and kill. And we know that doesn't work. That's not meaningful learning. So how can we engage with families, engage with communities to have a conversation about what kinds of schools do we want for our children? What kinds of schools do we want for our community? And how can we utilize those dollars to create those schools? I think we're at a critical point where we can either revert back to business as usual, or we can create something new. And I hope that, more communities than not are able to engage in that courageous conversation and do something different.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Laura, because, we've had conversations about how, I look at things as short game and long game, right? And oftentimes, when the wallet has been empty or very, very thin for a while, and now it's kind of bulging, there's a tendency to go out and just buy all the things that used to be just eye candy. And it's like, now I want all of this. Boom, boom, boom. Here goes the money, right? And there's no real, rhyme or reason as to, oh my gosh, because once it's gone, it's gone. And we have a tendency to be very short-sighted in either trying to rush and make something happen. And that sometimes that rush does revert to, well, we know this works. Let's just do what we've always done here. Versus, let's take a beat and a breath. And we know that people have been doing that. Most have over the course of the year been reflecting about, hey, it's been in our face. We've been talking about this. How do we ensure that when we do bring back kids, that our budgets are aligned in an equitable fashion? Like, what does that even look like? We can all talk a mean game, but the heavy lift is the actualization of those words. And so I think that the guardrails that you talk about, or the playbooks, the guidelines, whatever you want to call it, do you see, any of you see that as that money's already been, cast out there, do you think that there'll be other guidelines or playbooks coming down the pike from the federal level that will help people really stay true to that, to what we've been talking about for the last year, as Laura mentioned, this opportunity to rise out of the ashes, if you will, in an opportunity to do something pretty darn remarkable with the dollars that, like Dana said, have been unheard of before.
Yeah, the department's working on one right now. I believe they put out a call to organizations like us and others in the community for examples of effective practices with students, especially those students who are English learners and students with disabilities who we know are going without not just their education, but the additional services they need to access education. So the department, I imagine, will be just in a continuous process of collecting examples and putting that out. And of course, they're going to come out with more guidance, and they will be providing technical assistance and doing monitoring. But one big challenge in that is they are understaffed. And given the last 4 years, I would imagine that the working conditions at federal agencies is a little bit tougher. So I think the federal government's capacity to be able to provide states and counties and districts and schools the support that they normally would, it's a little hampered right now. So it's going to be up to organizations like ours to help, buffer that and provide that good information, and provide some of the watchdog function as well, to make sure that, states are true to their word, districts are true to their word, and they're not misusing funds. I think, as I said before, it's really easy to go back to business as usual. And we really can't if we want to be able to continue to make the case that funds like these are necessary when we have emergencies, we have to spend the money well.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, on that's like an exclamation point after that one. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back with a couple more questions.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.